While I was fighting a life-threatening infection in the hospital, my husband Dexter emptied our joint accounts and sold our home. "She probably won't make it anyway," he told his mistress while transferring the last $287,000 to his offshore account. When my grandmother's will arrived 3 days after I woke up, revealing my inheritance of her estate worth $4.2 million, I smiled. Then spent the next 6 months secretly building a case that would leave him with nothing but regret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Never saw it coming. 8 years of marriage, building a life together in our Victorian home in Oak Ridge, planning for retirement, and dreaming of the family we'd start someday soon. Dexter had always been the financial planner between us, the cautious one who insisted on emergency funds and investment strategies. That's what made his betrayal so brilliantly cruel. He'd positioned himself perfectly to dismantle our life the moment I couldn't stop him. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Sepsis from a seemingly minor infection had escalated overnight, sending my body into shock. I remember Dexter driving me to the emergency room, his face tight with what I thought was concern. Now I wonder if it was calculation, measuring how quickly he could act if I didn't survive. I spent 23 days unconscious, 23 days during which my husband of 8 years systematically emptied our accounts, sold stocks we'd carefully accumulated, listed our home with a real estate agent who specialized in quick sales, and began transferring assets to accounts I didn't know existed. By the time I opened my eyes, weak and disoriented in the hospital room, Dexter had liquidated nearly everything we owned. The infection had been aggressive, attacking my organs and requiring 2 emergency surgeries. The medical team had warned Dexter that my chances of survival were uncertain. Instead of hope, he saw opportunity. She'd been feeling off for weeks before the collapse. I later learned he told our friends. The doctors say even if she pulls through, there could be cognitive impairment. "We need to simplify our finances now, just in case." A perfect cover story for the perfect crime. Who would question a concerned husband consolidating finances while his wife fought for her life? Certainly not our friends, who dropped by with flowers and sympathy cards. Not my colleagues, who sent messages of support through Dexter since I was too fragile for visitors. Not even my younger sister Morgan, who lived across the country and relied on Dexter's updates about my condition. No one questioned him, except Nurse Kelsey Mitchell. Something felt off about him, she would later tell me. Most spouses of critically ill patients are either constantly present or completely overwhelmed. Your husband was neither. He'd visit for exactly 30 minutes each day, mostly on his phone checking accounts and making calls he'd step into the hallway for. It was Kelsey who first noticed the real estate agent's business card that fell from Dexter's jacket pocket. Kelsey who overheard him discussing liquidation timelines when he thought no one was listening. And Kelsey who, against hospital protocol but following her instincts, pulled up a chair beside my bed the moment I regained consciousness and said, "Your husband is selling your house. I think you need to know that right now." I remember the ceiling tiles swimming above me as I processed her words, the rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring my vital signs, the antiseptic smell that couldn't mask the sickening realization that while I fought for my life, the man who had vowed to stand by me, in sickness and in health, was dismantling everything we'd built. "How do you know?" My voice was barely a whisper, my throat raw from the ventilator they'd removed just days before. Kelsey glanced at the door, then pulled out her phone. I took photos. I know I shouldn't have, but something felt wrong. On her screen, images of documents Dexter had left visible while visiting. Property transfer forms, bank statements showing massive withdrawals, a rental agreement for a luxury apartment in Westlake Towers, the building where his administrative assistant lived. An assistant I'd met at company parties who always seemed to laugh too loudly at Dexter's jokes, who always found reasons to text him on weekends. He told everyone you'd changed your will before your hospitalization, Kelsey continued. That you'd agreed to sell the house if anything happened to you. No one questioned it because, well, who would make that up? Someone calculating. Someone who knew precisely how long it would take to transfer assets and establish a new life. Someone who'd been planning an exit long before my infection provided the perfect cover. My first tears weren't of sadness but of rage. A cold, clarifying anger that cut through the fog of medications and weakness. I'd always considered myself an intelligent woman, a corporate compliance officer who specialized in detecting fraud and misrepresentation. Yet I'd failed to see the deception in my own marriage. "There's more," Kelsey said, her voice dropping lower. "He's been visiting with a woman, not family. They hold hands when they think no one's watching." Of course. The pieces clicked into terrible clarity. The late nights at work, the business trips that seemed to multiply over the past year, the growing password protection on his phone and laptop, client confidentiality, he'd explained. "How much time do I have?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "The house closing is scheduled for next week, based on what I overheard. The doctor plans to discharge you to a rehabilitation facility for at least 2 weeks. After that, 10 days. I had 10 days before Dexter completed his disappearing act with everything we owned. "I need my phone," I said. "And I need you to tell everyone I'm experiencing post-surgical confusion, that I'm disoriented, having memory issues. Can you do that?" Kelsey nodded, understanding immediately. "You need him to think you don't know." "I need him to think I can't fight back," I corrected. What Dexter failed to calculate in his meticulous betrayal was that my grandmother Ruth had died 3 weeks before my hospitalization. What he couldn't have known was that her will was still being processed, held up by minor legal details, and what would soon destroy his perfect plan was that Grandma Ruth, stubborn, independent, and suspicious of the grandson-in-law who smiled too much and said too little, had left everything to me, with specific provisions that excluded Dexter from any claim to her estate. As Kelsey smuggled my phone into my room that night, I made my first silent promise. Dexter wouldn't just lose what he'd stolen from me. He would lose everything, and he would never see it coming, just as I hadn't. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs, but love has a way of blinding you to the obvious, especially when the deception is skillfully crafted by someone who knows your every vulnerability. I met Dexter Wilson at a charity auction 7 years before my hospitalization. I was 29, recently, promoted to senior compliance analyst at Meridian Financial, and still adjusting to life on my own after sharing an apartment with Morgan throughout my 20s. My sister had just moved across the country for a teaching position in Seattle, leaving me feeling unmoored in our hometown of Lakeside. Dexter approached me during the silent auction, pointing to the bid I'd placed on a weekend getaway to a mountain resort. "You have excellent taste," he said, his smile revealing a perfect dimple in his right cheek. "But you might want to increase your bid. That package is worth at least twice what you've offered." Instead of being annoyed at his presumption, I was charmed by his directness. He was handsome in an understated way, tall with dark hair always neatly trimmed, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and an impeccable sense of style that spoke of success without flashiness. "Are you an expert on mountain getaways?" I asked. "I'm an expert on value," he replied. "Investment management is my business." By the end of the evening, I'd won the auction package, having increased my bid on his advice, and gained his business card with a personal cell number written on the back. 3 days later, we had our first date at an intimate French restaurant where the chef knew him by name. 6 months later, we were discussing moving in together. By our 1-year anniversary, he had proposed with a vintage emerald ring that he said reminded him of my eyes. "You're the most honest person I've ever met, Ellie," he told me as he slipped the ring onto my finger. "In a world of complications, you're refreshingly straightforward. I need that in my life." I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, because his words reflected the image I held of myself. Ethical, straightforward, perhaps even a bit too rigid in my principles. As a compliance officer, my career was built on identifying deception and ensuring adherence to rules. I took pride in my ability to spot inconsistencies and enforce standards, yet I missed every red flag in my own relationship. Grandma Ruth hadn't, though. During our engagement dinner, I caught her studying Dexter with narrowed eyes while he charmed my parents with stories of his investment successes. "He's awfully smooth," she commented later as I helped her into her coat. "Men who have an answer for everything usually haven't been questioned enough." I dismissed her concerns as the natural skepticism of a woman who had survived both the Great Depression and the painful betrayal of my grandfather, who had left her for his secretary after 30 years of marriage. "Dexter's different," I assured her. "He values security and planning as much as I do." Ruth had simply patted my cheek and said, "Just make sure your name is on everything, Ellie Bell," using her special nickname for me from childhood. Separate accounts alongside the joint ones. A woman should always have her own safety net. I had nodded dutifully, but ultimately ignored her advice. Dexter had been so persuasive about the efficiency of consolidated accounts, about building our life as a true partnership without divisions. I'd prided myself on not being like Grandma Ruth, not letting old wounds dictate my choices in love. Our wedding was modest but elegant, held in the garden of Ruth's Victorian house, the very house that would later become central to my salvation. 50 guests, perfect weather, and vows we had written ourselves. Dexter's included a promise that particularly moved me. "I will be the guardian of your happiness and security, in abundance and in hardship." The early years of our marriage were everything I had hoped for. We purchased our home in Oak Ridge, a charming neighborhood of historical houses that needed updating but had solid bones, as Dexter described it. We spent weekends renovating, turning the century-old house into a blend of classic architecture and modern convenience. I focused on my career, while Dexter's investment business grew steadily. If there were moments that should have given me pause, his insistence on handling all our finances, his reluctance to have children despite our initial agreement to start a family by our 5th anniversary, his growing collection of locked file cabinets in his home office, I rationalized them away. He was detail-oriented. He wanted to be financially secure before bringing children into the world. Client confidentiality required discretion. The truth I didn't want to see was much simpler. Dexter had been constructing an exit strategy from the moment he said, "I do." The infection that nearly killed me began innocuously. Fatigue I attributed to overwork, a persistent low-grade fever I managed with over-the-counter medications. By the time I collapsed in our kitchen, my temperature soaring and my breathing labored, the bacteria had already entered my bloodstream. My last clear memory before the hospital was of Dexter kneeling beside me on the kitchen floor, phone in hand, his voice calm as he described my symptoms to the 911 operator. "Stay with me, Ellie," he said, squeezing my hand. "Everything will be different after this. I promise." A promise he kept, though not in the way I had understood it. As Nurse Kelsey helped me piece together the timeline during those first days of consciousness, I learned that Dexter had begun liquidating our assets within 48 hours of my admission to intensive care. The doctors had given him a grim prognosis. My organs were shutting down. And even if I survived, there might be neurological damage. He had nodded solemnly, asked appropriate questions, and then walked directly to our bank's regional branch to begin transferring funds. "Your condition gave him the perfect cover," Kelsey explained, showing me more photos she'd discreetly taken of documents he'd reviewed during visits. Everyone sympathized with the devoted husband facing his wife's possible death. No one questioned, his need to simplify financial matters during this difficult time. The perfect predator doesn't attack until the prey is weakened. Dexter had waited patiently for an opportunity, and when it came, he moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed each step mentally for years. As I lay in the hospital bed, still connected to monitors and IV lines, I wondered how I could have been so blind. The woman who had built her professional reputation on detecting fraud had failed to see it sleeping beside her every night for 8 years. Deception is most successful when built on a foundation of partial truths. The most convincing lies are those wrapped in enough honesty to make questioning them feel like paranoia. This was Dexter's true genius, creating a relationship where trust was weaponized against me. Our marriage had been filled with what I now recognized as calculated authenticity. Dexter had been meticulously genuine about small things, creating a pattern of trustworthiness that made it unthinkable to question the larger deceptions. He never forgot an anniversary or birthday. He remembered every friend's name, every office, conflict I mentioned, every preference I expressed casually. He could recall exactly what I'd worn on our first date, that emerald blouse that made your eyes look like summer leaves, and surprised me on our 5th anniversary with a replica he'd had custom-made after the original wore out. These thoughtful gestures created a foundation of attentiveness that made his financial secrecy seem like a quirk rather than a warning. When he insisted on managing our investments because you're already mentally exhausted from compliance work, all day, it felt like consideration rather than control. "You've built such a beautiful life together," my friend Deborah had commented at our last dinner party before my illness. She'd gazed around our meticulously renovated living room, with its original crown molding and modern furnishings. "Dexter clearly adores you," and I believed he did. How could I not? He brought me coffee every morning, prepared exactly as I liked. It, 1 sugar, splash of almond milk, served in the ceramic mug I'd bought on our honeymoon in Portugal. He listened attentively when I spoke about work challenges. He planned thoughtful date nights that always incorporated something meaningful to our history together. My parents adored him. "You hit the jackpot," my mother would say. "A successful man who actually listens when you talk." My father, typically reserved with his approval, had embraced Dexter as the son he never had, spending weekends with him restoring vintage furniture for our home. Only Morgan and Grandma Ruth maintained a sliver of skepticism. Morgan, with her psychological training, once observed after a holiday visit, "He performs affection very well, but I wonder if he's ever spontaneous with it." I'd dismissed her comment as the natural cynicism of someone whose own relationships tended toward brief intensity rather than lasting commitment. "Not everyone expresses love dramatically," I'd replied defensively. "Dexter shows his devotion through consistency." Consistency. That was the quality I'd valued most in our relationship, the characteristic I'd praised when friends complained about unpredictable partners. Dexter was steady, reliable, present. Until suddenly, he wasn't. As I recovered enough strength to sit, up in my hospital bed, I began the painful process of examining our relationship without the filter of trust I'd applied for 8 years. Each memory shifted under this new scrutiny, revealing shadows I'd refused to see. The separate office with its locked cabinets that I respected his privacy by never questioning. The business trips that increased in frequency over the past 2 years, always to cities where cell reception was surprisingly unreliable. The way he would deflect conversations about children with discussions of future financial goals instead. His insistence that my name be removed from certain investment accounts to protect you from liability, a concern that had seemed thoughtful. Coming from someone who supposedly prioritized my security, even his relationship with my grandmother now revealed warning signs. Dexter had been unfailingly polite to Ruth, but always maintained a careful distance. He accompanied me to Sunday dinners at her Victorian home, but always found reasons to step away for business calls. When Ruth questioned anything about our finances or his business, he redirected the conversation with practiced charm. "Your grandmother is from a different generation," he would explain afterward. "Financial transparency wasn't common in her day. It makes her uncomfortable to discuss modern investment strategies." Now I understood his avoidance had nothing to do with generational differences and everything to do with Ruth's uncanny ability to detect deception. My grandmother, widowed young and then abandoned by my grandfather decades later, had developed a finely tuned radar for insincerity that all my professional training couldn't match. Among the papers Kelsey had photographed was a real estate listing for our home that particularly gutted me. The master bedroom I'd painted myself, described as recently refreshed. The garden where I'd spent countless weekends, listed as low-maintenance landscaping. The kitchen we'd renovated together during our second year of marriage, with the vintage tile I'd sourced from a specialty salvage shop, reduced to updated with modern amenities. 8 years of creating a home, erased and repackaged for quick sale. "He's asking below market value," Kelsey noted, showing me the listing. The agent's notes mention a motivated seller seeking immediate closure. Of course, a quick sale meant liquid assets that could be moved before I potentially recovered. The pieces of Dexter's plan clicked together with horrifying precision. Empty the accounts, sell the house, transfer everything to untraceable locations, and establish residence with his mistress before I was coherent enough to contest any of it. By the time I could take legal action, there would be nothing left to recover. He would express profound regret over making necessary financial decisions during an emotional time, claim he was acting in both our interests given my uncertain prognosis, and walk away with everything we'd built. "Have there been any calls about my condition?" I asked Kelsey. "From my sister? My parents?" Kelsey checked my chart. "Your husband has requested that all medical updates go through him. He told the floor supervisor that your family is elderly and easily confused by medical terminology. My parents were in their early 70s and perfectly capable of understanding complex information. Morgan was a clinical psychologist who would comprehend my condition better than most." The isolation was clearly strategic, another layer of Dexter's careful planning. "He's limited visitors, too," Kelsey added. "Said you need complete rest and that visitors would tax your system." The perfect cover. If no one saw me improving, no one would warn me about what was happening to my life outside the hospital walls. If family couldn't speak directly with my doctors, they would rely entirely on Dexter's filtered updates. On the third day of my conscious recovery, Dexter arrived for his precisely timed 30-minute visit. Following Kelsey's suggestion, I pretended to be significantly more disoriented than I actually was. I slurred words, asked repetitive questions, and stared vacantly for extended periods, a performance of cognitive impairment that gave me the opportunity to study my husband without his knowledge. He was immaculately dressed as always. Charcoal. Suit, crisp white shirt, the blue silk tie I'd given him for his last birthday. His expression was appropriately concerned when nursing staff were present, relaxing into impatience when we were alone. "The doctors say you're stabilizing physically," he told me, scrolling through his phone as he spoke. "But they're concerned about cognitive function. You might need extended rehabilitation." I mumbled something intentionally incomprehensible, watching as relief flickered across his features. "Don't worry about anything," he continued, patting my hand without looking up from his screen. "I'm handling all the practical matters. Just focus on basic recovery." In that moment, studying his familiar profile, the straight nose, the dimple that appeared with even the slightest smile, the precisely trimmed hair at his temples now showing the first strands of distinguished gray, I felt a strange detachment. This man who had shared my bed, my home, my most intimate confidences for 8 years was effectively a stranger. Perhaps he always had been. "House?" I managed to ask, intentionally feeble. His response was smooth, practiced. "Everything's fine at home. I've managed some simplifications to reduce your stress when you return. The doctors think familiar surroundings might be challenging for a while. Simplifications. Such a benign word for systematic theft. When he left, promising to return the following day, I waited until the door closed before letting my face relax from its manufactured confusion into cold clarity. I had 18 minutes before the next scheduled vitals check, 18 minutes to begin planning my counter strategy. The earliest warning signs had been subtle, so subtle that I'd rationalized each one individually. Only now, with the devastating clarity that comes from betrayal, could I see the pattern they formed. It began approximately 14 months before my illness, around the time Dexter hired Emma Sullivan as his administrative assistant. He'd mentioned the hire casually over dinner, describing her as extremely competent, if a bit overqualified for the role. She had a business degree but had taken time away from her career to care for an ailing parent. Now, at 32, she was rebuilding her professional life. His voice had held appropriate professional admiration, nothing that triggered concern. I met Emma 3 weeks later at Dexter's office holiday party. She was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Tall, with auburn hair cut in a precise bob, intelligent green eyes, and a quiet confidence that commanded attention without seeking it. She greeted me with perfect professional courtesy, calling me Mrs. Wilson, despite my insistence on Ellie. "Your husband speaks so highly of you," she'd said, her smile revealing a slight asymmetry that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her appeal. "He says your attention to detail is unmatched." I remember feeling flattered that Dexter discussed me positively with his staff. Now I wonder if that comment had been carefully crafted to disarm me from the beginning. The changes in our home life accumulated gradually after Emma's arrival. Dexter began working later, citing new clients with complex portfolios. Our regular Friday date nights became sporadic, often rescheduled due to client emergencies. He grew increasingly protective of his phone, enabling additional security features and angling the screen away when texting. When I mentioned these changes to Deborah during our monthly lunch, she offered the perspective I wanted to hear. "That's the price of success, isn't it? Adam's the same way since his promotion. The more responsibility they have, the more boundaries they need between work and home." I'd nodded in agreement, suppressing the unease that had prompted my observation in the first place. After all, Dexter's business was growing. The changes in his behavior could be attributed to professional stress. Rather than personal deception, I prided myself on being a supportive wife who understood the demands of ambition. Then came the first financial anomaly, a credit card statement with a $340 charge from Riverview Hotel, an upscale establishment downtown. When I mentioned it, casually, expecting a simple explanation of a client meeting or business lunch, Dexter's response had been uncharacteristically flustered. "Tax planning seminar," he'd said after a moment's hesitation. "The firm hosting it arranged accommodation, but there was a billing error. They'll reimburse us." A reasonable explanation, yet something in his delivery felt rehearsed. The reimbursement appeared on our account 2 days later, suspiciously prompt for corporate processing. I now suspect he transferred money from another account to cover the evidence of what was likely a rendezvous with Emma. 6 months before my hospitalization, Dexter suggested restructuring our retirement accounts. "The market's volatile," he explained, showing me projections on his laptop. "We need to diversify differently. I've found some interesting international options that could shield us if the domestic market downturns." I trusted his financial expertise. Why wouldn't I? He managed money for successful professionals across the city. His clients included doctors, attorneys, and corporate executives who entrusted their financial futures to his guidance. The required signatures authorizing these changes felt like a formality, supporting my husband's professional judgment rather than abdicating control of my financial security. When Dexter mentioned opening an account in the Cayman Islands 3 months later, I did experience a moment of genuine concern. Isn't that where people hide money? I asked, only half joking. His explanation was comprehensive and reassuring. It's about legitimate tax efficiency, not evasion, he said, his tone patient rather than defensive. Many prudent investors utilize international banking. The regulations have changed significantly. It's all above board and reported properly to the IRS. He showed me articles from financial publications supporting his claims. He walked me through the supposed benefits to our portfolio's diversification. He made international banking seem like a standard practice for forward-thinking investors. What I didn't question was why my name wasn't on these new accounts. The documentation he showed me referenced D. Wilson Holdings rather than our joint names. When I did eventually ask about this discrepancy, his answer seemed logical. International accounts have complicated signatory requirements. Adding you would double the paperwork and regulatory hurdles. Everything still benefits both of us. It's just administratively simpler this way. I believed him because I had no reason not to. Because questioning him would have meant questioning the foundation of trust in our marriage. Because I couldn't imagine that the man who brought me fresh coffee each morning was systematically separating me from our assets. The most significant change, the one I should have recognized as a 5-alarm warning, came when Dexter suggested selling Grandma Ruth's jewelry. She had given me several valuable pieces over the years, including an Art Deco diamond bracelet that had been her mother's and a sapphire pendant my grandfather had given her on their 10th anniversary. Insurance on those pieces is expensive, Dexter noted one evening as I was dressing for a charity event, fastening the bracelet around my wrist. And they spend most of their time in a safe deposit box. We could invest the proceeds more productively. Something in his tone made me clutch the bracelet protectively. These are family heirlooms, Dexter. They're not about monetary value. For once, I held firm despite his persuasive arguments about emotional versus financial assets and the pragmatism of liquidation versus storage. The jewelry stayed in our safe deposit box, a small victory I didn't recognize the significance of until much later. Now, lying in my hospital bed and piecing together the progression of Dexter's deception, I understood these incidents as what they truly were: trial balloons. Each suggestion tested my compliance, my willingness to accept his financial decisions without thorough scrutiny. Each success emboldened him further, confirming that his careful construction of trust had created the perfect environment for exploitation. The weekend trips that had become more frequent in the past year, financial conferences in Chicago, client meetings in Boston, networking events in San Francisco, had any of them been legitimate? Or had they all been opportunities to establish his new life with Emma, funded by our joint resources? With bitter clarity, I remembered the change in Dexter after my grandmother's funeral 3 weeks before my hospitalization. Ruth had passed peacefully in her sleep at 94, leaving behind the Victorian house she'd fought to keep in her divorce from my grandfather and a lifetime of careful investments. Dexter had been surprisingly attentive during the funeral arrangements, handling details I was too grief-stricken to manage. He'd stood solemnly beside me at the service, his arm steady around my waist as I accepted condolences from Ruth's wide circle of friends and community connections. Yet, on the drive home, he'd asked an unexpected question. "Did your grandmother ever discuss her will with you?" The timing had felt inappropriate, but I'd attributed it to his practical nature, his tendency to address logistical matters during emotional times. "She always said everything would come to me," I'd answered, staring out the passenger window at the passing landscape. But we never discussed specifics. His follow-up question should have alerted me. Would the inheritance come to you personally or to both of us as a couple? But wrapped in grief and emotional exhaustion, I'd simply murmured, "I don't know. Dexter, the lawyer will contact us when it's appropriate." Had that conversation been the catalyst? Had the prospect of an inheritance that might remain legally separate from our marital assets accelerated whatever exit strategy he'd been cultivating? Had my illness merely provided the perfect opportunity for a plan he'd already set in motion? These questions circled in my mind as I watched Dexter during his carefully timed hospital visits, studying his performance of concern while planning my response to his betrayal. The man who believed I was too cognitively impaired to understand my surroundings had no idea that every sympathetic nod, every progress report delivered to the empty air above my head, every whispered phone conversation in the hallway was being cataloged as evidence. "The house closing is next Tuesday," he told someone on the phone, his voice drifting through my partially open door. "The doctors say she'll be transferred to Lakeside Rehabilitation by Thursday. Perfect timing." Perfect timing indeed, but not in the way he anticipated. Nurse Kelsey Mitchell wasn't supposed to be assigned to my case. The scheduling change that placed her on the post-ICU floor during my transfer was a last-minute substitution for a colleague with a family emergency. Had that colleague's child not developed a sudden fever, had Kelsey not agreed to switch shifts, the entire trajectory of my recovery, both medical and financial, might have been drastically different. Some might call it coincidence. I've come to think of it as Grandma Ruth's first intervention from beyond. Kelsey was 34, with 10 years of nursing experience and a lifetime of what she called people-reading skills. With dark curly hair often corralled into a practical bun and observant hazel eyes behind simple glasses, she moved through the hospital with efficient compassion. Patients trusted her instantly. Something about her direct gaze and no-nonsense. Delivery of information inspired confidence even in crisis. "I've worked this floor for 7 years," she told me on the 4th day of my conscious recovery, checking my vitals with practiced precision. You develop a sense for family dynamics. There's a difference between genuine concern and performance. Kelsey's suspicions had been triggered during her first interaction with Dexter, when he'd asked detailed questions about my prognosis, but none about my comfort or immediate needs. Most spouses want to know if you're in pain, if you're afraid, if there's anything they can bring to make you feel more at home, she explained, adjusting my pillows. Your husband wanted to know about cognitive recovery timelines and decision-making capacity. What solidified her concerns was a conversation she overheard while Dexter thought the nursing station was unmanned. Standing in the medication room, with the door ajar, Kelsey had heard him speaking with someone, presumably Emma, about contingency plans if she recovers more quickly than expected. "I couldn't hear everything," Kelsey admitted, "but I distinctly heard him say that by the time she's coherent enough to understand what's happening, everything will be finalized. The accounts are almost completely transferred." That evening, Kelsey had begun her subtle investigation. She noted the documents Dexter reviewed during visits. She photographed papers he left temporarily unattended when stepping out for calls. She documented conversations and behaviors that struck her as inconsistent with a devoted husband's concerns. "I'm probably overstepping professional boundaries," she acknowledged, showing me the evidence she'd gathered. "But I've seen financial elder abuse in my nursing home rotations. This feels eerily similar, taking advantage of someone who can't defend their interests. The only difference is your vulnerability is temporary. Temporary, if I acted quickly enough." Kelsey became my lifeline to the outside world. While maintaining a professional facade around Dexter and other staff members, she created a parallel information network that kept me informed of his actions. She smuggled in my phone, brought me updates on the house sale from public records she accessed during breaks, and most importantly, contacted Morgan without Dexter's knowledge. "Your sister needs to know what's happening," Kelsey insisted, "and we need someone with legal authority who isn't your husband." I hesitated, calculating risks versus benefits. Morgan lived across the country, teaching psychology at a university in Seattle. Alerting her would mean pulling her away from her responsibilities. More concerning was the possibility that any unusual travel or communication patterns might alert Dexter that his plan had been discovered. "If he realizes I know, he'll accelerate everything," I whispered. "We need him to believe he has time." Kelsey considered this, then offered a solution. What if she doesn't come directly to the hospital? What if she flies in but stays elsewhere, gathering information without his knowledge? The plan took shape between my medical treatments and Dexter's predictable visits. Morgan would fly to Lakeside under the pretense of attending a professional conference, simultaneously investigating Dexter's actions while avoiding any direct contact with him. Kelsey would serve as our secure communication channel, relaying information during her shifts. While we waited for Morgan's arrival, Kelsey expanded her intelligence-gathering activities with remarkable ingenuity. During one of Dexter's visits, she accidentally spilled water on his jacket, necessitating its removal. While apologetically hanging it to dry in the staff area, she quickly searched the pockets, discovering business cards for both a high-end real estate agent specializing in international properties and an offshore banking specialist. "He's not just planning to take your money," she told me, showing me photos of the cards. "He's planning to leave the country with it." Her most valuable discovery came through an unexpected connection. Kelsey's brother Oliver worked in network security for a regional bank. Not our bank, but one that operated in the same financial ecosystem. I asked him hypothetically what records would exist if someone was emptying accounts and moving money. "Offshore," she explained. "He says there's always a trail, but you need proper legal authority to access it." This insight shaped our evolving strategy. We wouldn't just need evidence of Dexter's actions. We would need legal standing to compel financial institutions to reveal the detailed transaction records that would prove his systematic theft. Kelsey's risk-taking on my behalf went beyond professional obligation. When I asked why she was investing so much in helping a patient she'd known less than a week, her answer revealed the personal principle driving her actions. "My mother lost everything to her second husband," she said simply. "He did the same thing, isolated her from family, took control of finances, and then disappeared with everything when she developed health problems. No one believed her until it was too late. I promised myself I'd never ignore those signs again." On the 7th day of my conscious recovery, as my physical strength gradually returned, Kelsey arrived for her shift with news that changed everything. "There's a certified letter for you," she said, placing an envelope on my tray table. "It came to your house, but the delivery required a signature. Your husband wasn't home, so they left a notice. I called the sender. It's from Hargrove and Associates law firm, Grandma Ruth's attorneys. I picked it up impersonating your household assistant," she added with a small smile. "Probably illegal, definitely unethical, but I think you'll forgive me." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope that would become the foundation of my counterattack. The certified letter from Hargrove and Associates contained the complete details of Grandma Ruth's will, and with it, the full scope of both. My inheritance and Dexter's betrayal came into devastating focus. Ruth Elizabeth Montgomery had left me her entire estate. The Victorian home in the historic district valued at $1.2 million, investment accounts totaling approximately $2.8 million, her art collection conservatively appraised at $180,000, and various other assets including a vacation cottage on Lake Simmons. The total inheritance approached $4.2 million, all explicitly designated to me, separately and individually from any marital property considerations. Ruth's foresight was both a blessing and a painful confirmation. A specific clause stated, "This inheritance is intended solely for my granddaughter, Eleanor Montgomery Wilson, and shall remain her separate property notwithstanding her marital status. Her spouse shall have no legal claim or interest in these assets." She had even included a no-contest provision that would redirect the entire inheritance to various women's shelters if Dexter challenged the will. My grandmother had never trusted him, and she had structured her final gift to protect me from exactly the scenario that was now unfolding. More shocking than the inheritance itself was what the legal documents revealed about Dexter's recent activities. Clipped to the will was a note from Harold Hargrove, Ruth's attorney for over 30 years. "Mrs. Wilson, I feel obligated to inform you that your husband has contacted our office 3 times since your grandmother's passing, inquiring about the status of her estate and claiming to represent your interests during your illness. As per your grandmother's explicit instructions, we have not disclosed any information to him. He became quite insistent during his last call, suggesting that, as your spouse and financial manager, he had legal authority to receive the inheritance on your behalf. This is categorically untrue under the terms of your grandmother's will. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss the proper transfer of assets. I stared at the papers, mental puzzle pieces locking into place. Dexter's unusual attentiveness after Ruth's funeral, his pointed questions about her will, his accelerated timeline once my illness provided the perfect cover. He hadn't just opportunistically decided to steal our joint assets when I became ill. He had been actively plotting to gain control of my inheritance, likely planning to disappear with both. My hospitalization had simply accelerated a scheme already in motion. I handed the documents to Kelsey, my hands trembling not from weakness but from rage. He knew, I whispered. He knew what was coming to me and planned to take it all. Kelsey scanned the papers, her expression hardening as she understood the implications. The house sale, the account transfers. He's clearing away everything he can legally access before this inheritance arrives. Because once I receive this inheritance, as separate property, he can't touch it without my signature. I finished her thought. He needs to complete his theft of our joint assets before I receive the protection of these separate assets. The calculated precision of his betrayal was breathtaking. Had I died from the infection, a possibility the doctors had apparently communicated as substantial, Dexter would have inherited our joint property automatically as my spouse. The house, our investments, everything we'd built together would have become his. My survival complicated his plan, but didn't derail it. By liquidating our joint assets while I was incapacitated, he could still walk away with everything we owned. Together. The only thing he couldn't reach was Ruth's inheritance, explicitly designated as separate property, unless he could somehow gain control of it before I was declared competent to manage my own affairs. Hence his persistent calls to Ruth's attorney. Hence his questions to medical staff about my cognitive recovery timeline. Hence his careful isolation of me from family and friends who might alert me to his activities. He's been setting this up for months, maybe years, I said, the weight of this realization settling like ice in my chest. The separate accounts, the international connections, the careful documentation of our joint assets. He was creating a complete inventory of what he could legally take. But Dexter had miscalculated in multiple ways. He hadn't anticipated my earlier-than-expected recovery from the infection. He hadn't counted on Kelsey's intervention. Most critically, he hadn't expected Ruth's will to arrive precisely when I needed its protection most. "We need to move quickly," Kelsey said, organizing the papers with clinical efficiency. "The house closing is scheduled for Tuesday. Your bank accounts are nearly emptied. And, based on what I've overheard, he's planning to move the remaining funds offshore by the end of next week." I nodded, a strange calm replacing my initial shock. The compliance officer in me, the professional who had built a career identifying and documenting financial irregularities, began to emerge from beneath the betrayed wife. "I need Morgan to contact Harold Hargrove immediately," I said. "We need to secure the inheritance before Dexter realizes I know about it. And I need a forensic accountant, someone who can trace exactly what he's taken and where it's gone." Kelsey was already texting Morgan with the attorney's contact information. "Your sister arrived last night. She's staying with a colleague in Westridge, far enough from your neighborhood that Dexter won't accidentally spot her." Another thought struck me with sudden urgency. The safe deposit box, my grandmother's jewelry. He doesn't have independent access, but he might try to convince the bank that I've authorized him to empty it. Kelsey added this to the growing list of vulnerabilities we needed to address. "What about medical power of attorney? Does he have authority to make decisions about your care? I closed my eyes, mentally reviewing the documents we'd signed years earlier, when such provisions had seemed like responsible planning rather than potential weapons. Yes, but it only applies if I'm incapacitated. Now that I'm conscious and demonstrably improving, he shouldn't have that authority unless he successfully argues I'm not mentally competent. Which explains why he keeps asking about cognitive impairment and emphasizing your confusion to the medical team, Kelsey concluded. He's laying groundwork to maintain control even after your physical recovery. The depth of his betrayal, the methodical dismantling of not just our financial life but potentially my very autonomy, left me momentarily breathless. This was not opportunistic theft. This was calculated destruction. What kind of person did that make Dexter? Had everything in our 8 years together been a performance? Or had he initially married me for conventional reasons before recognizing the potential for financial exploitation? Had I ever truly known him at all? These questions would have to wait. Right now, protecting what remained of my assets and securing my inheritance before Dexter could intercept it took priority over understanding the psychology behind his betrayal. I need a lawyer of my own, I said firmly. Someone specialized in emergency financial injunctions, and I need Dr. Emmett to formally document my cognitive competence. Kelsey nodded. I'll speak with him during rounds tomorrow. He's already noted your rapid improvement in the charts. For the first time since waking in the hospital, I felt a spark of something beyond anger or fear. It was purpose, cold, clarifying, purpose that focused my mind and steadied my still recovering body. Dexter believed he was stealing from someone too weak to fight back. He was about to discover just how thoroughly he had underestimated his wife. The pivotal moment in my recovery, both medical and financial, came on the 8th day after regaining consciousness. Dr. Emmett Lewis, the neurologist who had been monitoring my cognitive function since I'd emerged from critical condition, completed a comprehensive assessment of my mental capacity. Contrary to the impression Dexter had been cultivating among the medical staff, Dr. Lewis found no significant cognitive impairment. Mrs. Wilson demonstrates complete orientation to time, place, and circumstance, he noted in my chart. Memory function appears intact, decision-making capacity uncompromised, and reasoning skills appropriate to her education and professional background. While physical recovery continues to require monitoring, from a neurological perspective, the patient is fully competent to make her own medical and financial decisions. This clinical evaluation became the cornerstone of what Kelsey had begun calling Operation Recovery, our multifaceted plan to counter Dexter's theft before it was completed. With documented medical confirmation of my competence, we could begin dismantling the structure of lies he had built around my condition. Morgan arrived at the hospital that afternoon, slipping in during Dexter's predictable absence and bringing with her the fierce protectiveness that had characterized our relationship since childhood. At 34, 2 years my junior, my sister had always possessed an emotional intelligence that complemented my more analytical nature. Her training as a clinical psychologist had only sharpened her already formidable ability to read people and situations. I always sensed something off about him, she said, tightly gripping my hand across the hospital bed rail. But I never imagined this level of calculation. Morgan had been busy since her arrival in town. She had met with Harold Hargrove, who was now expediting the transfer of Ruth's estate into accounts that would be completely separate from any marital assets. She had photographed the for sale sign in front of our house, documenting the sudden listing that Dexter had never discussed with me. Most valuably, she had contacted Vivian Taylor, a former colleague who now specialized in emergency financial interventions for vulnerable individuals. Vivian's agreed to take your case, Morgan said, pulling a leather portfolio from her bag. She needs your signature on these documents to file for an emergency injunction freezing all joint assets pending investigation of potential financial exploitation. I signed the papers with a hand that still trembled slightly from residual weakness, but was steadied by growing resolve. The compliance officer in me recognized the legal strategy Vivian was employing, using elder abuse statutes that had been expanded in recent years to cover exploitation of medically vulnerable individuals of any age. "What about the house closing?" I asked, thinking of the rapidly approaching Tuesday deadline. "Vivian's filing the injunction first thing tomorrow morning," Morgan explained. "It should hit the system before any closing can be completed. She's also notifying the real estate agent directly about potential fraud in the transaction." While Morgan had been building our legal counteroffensive, Kelsey had continued gathering evidence from the hospital side. She had documented every visit Dexter made, noting specifically his representations of my condition to medical staff versus the reality documented in my charts. She had collected statements from other nurses who had overheard concerning comments. Most damning, she had recorded a conversation where Dexter specifically instructed a resident physician not to confuse Ellie with too many medical details given her cognitive fragility, directly contradicting Dr. Lewis's documented assessment. "It's a good start," I acknowledged, reviewing our growing evidence file. "But we need to be strategic about when we reveal that I know what's happening. Timing is everything." I was thinking like an investigator now, not a victim. Each piece of evidence needed to be secured and documented before Dexter realized his plan had been discovered. Once he knew I was fighting back, he would likely accelerate his efforts to move assets beyond reach. "The inheritance is the key," I continued, mentally organizing our priorities. "Once Ruth's assets are secured in my name as separate property, we'll have financial resources to fight whatever comes next. But until then, we need Dexter to believe his plan is working." Morgan nodded, understanding my reasoning. "Vivian suggests maintaining the appearance of cognitive impairment while the legal groundwork is being laid. She's prepared emergency petitions, not just for the injunction, but also for temporary financial guardianship, naming me rather than Dexter, if needed." The irony wasn't lost on me. Dexter had been cultivating the narrative of my cognitive decline to maintain control of our finances. Now we would use that same narrative as cover while we built our case against him, only revealing my true condition when it served our strategy. That evening, after Morgan left and Kelsey went off shift, I lay in the darkened hospital room thinking about the path forward. The emotional devastation of Dexter's betrayal remained a wound I couldn't yet fully examine. Instead, I focused on the practical challenge before me, reclaiming what was rightfully mine while creating consequences for his actions. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine an outcome beyond mere damage control. What if I could not only protect my inheritance and recover our joint assets, but also ensure Dexter faced appropriate legal penalties for his actions? What if this betrayal, intended to destroy me financially, instead became the catalyst for a complete reclamation of my independence? I had spent 8 years deferring to Dexter's financial expertise, gradually surrendering control of our shared resources to his supposedly superior knowledge. That deference had nearly cost me everything. Never again would I entrust my security to someone else's management, no matter how convincing their credentials or how intimate our relationship. The next morning brought the first tangible victory in our counteroffensive. Harold Hargrove called Morgan with news that the initial paperwork transferring Ruth's house directly to me had been completed. The property would not pass through probate, thanks to a transfer-on-death deed Ruth had established years earlier, a shrewd planning move that now worked perfectly for our compressed timeline. "The house is legally yours as of this morning," Morgan reported, showing me the confirmation on her tablet. "Separate property, completely excluded from marital assets. Dexter can't touch it." A weight lifted from my chest, not just because the Victorian home represented significant financial security, but because it had been Ruth's sanctuary for decades. The thought of preserving her home, with its wraparound porch where she'd taught me to play gin rummy in the window seat where she'd read me stories as a child, provided emotional sustenance beyond its monetary value. Kelsey arrived for her shift with more good news. Dr. Lewis has ordered your transfer to the rehabilitation floor tomorrow instead of Thursday. Your physical recovery is progressing faster than expected. The rehabilitation floor meant fewer restrictions on visitors, more freedom of movement, and, crucially, greater privacy for our planning sessions. Each small victory built momentum for the larger battle ahead. Dexter's scheduled to visit at 2, Kelsey reminded me. Same performance as before? I nodded, settling back against the pillows and arranging my features into the slightly vacant expression I'd been practicing. One last confused conversation before things change. The compliance officer who had built her career identifying deception was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime, playing the vulnerable victim while methodically dismantling her betrayer's carefully constructed plan. The turning point wasn't just in my recovery. It was in my fundamental understanding of my own strength. Dexter had seen me as exploitable. He was about to discover just how formidable an adversary I could be. Professional investigators understand that successful cases require more than just evidence. They require meticulous planning, precise timing, and methodical execution. As a compliance officer who had overseen dozens of internal financial investigations, I knew the difference between knowing someone had committed fraud and being able to prove it conclusively. The day after securing Ruth's house, Morgan, Kelsey, and I convened what we called our war council in my new room on the rehabilitation floor. With greater privacy and the improved physical stamina that came with each day of recovery, I could finally engage in sustained strategic planning. We need to map everything Dexter has access to, I began, my professional training taking over. Every account, every asset, every financial connection. Then we categorize them by vulnerability and prioritize our protective actions. Morgan had brought a whiteboard from the nurse's station, and Kelsey had secured the door to ensure privacy. On the board, I began creating a comprehensive inventory of my financial life, both what Dexter had already taken and what remained, at risk. Joint checking and savings accounts at First Meridian Bank, I listed. Approximately $42,000 remaining from an original balance of $178,000, based on Kelsey's photos of statements Dexter reviewed during visits. Investment portfolio with Wilson Financial Services, primarily index funds and municipal bonds. Original value approximately $240,000. Current status unknown. Retirement accounts, my 401k through Meridian Financial, roughly $215,000. Dexter's SEP IRA, value unknown. Real estate, primary residence in Oak Ridge, purchased for $380,000. Current market value approximately $520,000. Currently listed for sale at $475,000. Personal property, household furnishings, my grandmother's jewelry and safe deposit box, 2 vehicles, my Volvo, his Audi. The list continued, creating a comprehensive picture of what we were fighting to protect or recover. Alongside these assets, I noted existing protections and vulnerabilities for each. The first priority is preventing further loss, I explained, thinking through our defensive strategy. Vivian's emergency injunction should freeze the remaining joint assets, but we need to assume Dexter will try to circumvent it. Morgan nodded, taking notes on her laptop. Vivian says judges typically act quickly on these petitions given the risk of irreparable harm. She expects the temporary order by tomorrow afternoon. Next, we need to secure what he hasn't yet accessed. I continued. The retirement accounts have some statutory protection, but we should still place fraud alerts. And someone needs to physically go to the bank to secure the safe deposit box. I can do that, Morgan volunteered. With a copy of your medical capacity assessment and power of attorney, I should be able to at least ensure no one else accesses it. As we outlined these defensive measures, Kelsey raised the critical question we'd been circling around. When do we let Dexter know that Ellie is fully aware and fighting back? The longer we maintain the pretense of her confusion, the more time we have to build our case. But every day also gives him more opportunity to hide assets. It was the central strategic decision. In financial fraud investigations, this moment, when to reveal to the suspect that you're onto them, often determined whether assets could be recovered or would disappear permanently. We need to create a comprehensive documentation trail before confrontation, I decided. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every liquidation needs to be recorded and connected to Dexter specifically. We're not just trying to freeze assets, we're building a case for criminal charges and civil recovery. This approach reflected my professional training. Evidence gathered before a suspect becomes defensive is typically more comprehensive and easier to authenticate. Once Dexter realized I was building a case against him, documents would disappear, narratives would shift, and recovery would become exponentially more difficult. We need a dual track, I explained. Legal protection through the courts alongside forensic financial investigation. The injunction buys us time by temporarily freezing joint assets, but the forensic accounting will reveal where already moved money has gone. Morgan tapped her pen against her notepad thoughtfully. What about Emma Sullivan? She's clearly involved. Should we be investigating her as well? It was a valid question. Emma's role as both Dexter's assistant and apparent romantic partner complicated our investigation. Was she a co-conspirator in the financial fraud, or merely the motivation for his exit strategy? The distinction would matter both legally and practically in terms of recovery. We need to understand their relationship timeline, I agreed. If she was involved in planning the financial deception, she could potentially be held liable as well. But for now, let's focus on Dexter and the money. Emma is a secondary concern. Kelsey, ever practical, redirected us to immediate actions. Dr. Lewis is scheduling your discharge evaluation for Friday. Assuming you pass, and there's every indication you will, you'll need somewhere safe to go. You can't return to the house Dexter is actively trying to sell. This practical consideration had been weighing on me. While Ruth's house would eventually provide shelter, the legal transfer of ownership was still being processed. My physical recovery, though progressing well, still required some assistance. And most importantly, my safety might be at risk once Dexter realized his plan had been discovered. I've spoken with Dr. Lewis about extending your hospital stay based on legitimate physical therapy needs, Kelsey suggested. We could potentially buy another week of secure accommodation while legal proceedings advance. Morgan offered an alternative. My colleague has offered her guest house. It's private, secure, and Dexter has no knowledge of her or the location. As we weighed these options, I found myself evaluating risks not just to my financial security, but to my physical safety. The man I had shared my life with for 8 years was systematically stealing everything we owned together. What else might he be capable of when cornered? My strategic planning had to account for this uncomfortable possibility. While I had no evidence that Dexter would resort to physical intimidation or violence, I also had never imagined he would systematically dismantle our financial life. The boundaries of what I believed him capable of had been irrevocably redrawn. We planned for worst-case scenarios, I decided, the investigator in me overriding the emotional discomfort. Secure accommodation, restricted information about my recovery, and legal protection through restraining orders if necessary. As our planning session continued, a clear strategy emerged, one that leveraged my professional expertise, Ruth's timely inheritance, and the evidence Kelsey had been gathering. We would move methodically, building our case while systematically closing each vulnerability Dexter might exploit. The compliance officer in me recognized this as what we called a progressive disclosure investigation, revealing our knowledge, gradually in strategic phases that each triggered predictable responses from the suspect. These responses typically provided additional evidence while limiting further damage. For the first time since discovering Dexter's betrayal, I felt something. Beyond anger or determination. I felt the cold clarity of professional purpose, the same mindset that had helped me unravel complex financial schemes throughout my career. Dexter had chosen the wrong woman to betray. He didn't just marry an inheritance, he married a financial investigator with the skills to dismantle his scheme piece by methodical piece. Few people at Meridian Financial knew exactly what my role as compliance officer entailed. Colleagues understood vaguely that I reviewed transactions for regulatory adherence, but the specifics of my work remained largely undefined in casual conversation. This professional obscurity had suited me. Compliance officers generally prefer to work without drawing attention to their investigations. What Dexter had apparently never fully grasped was the specialized nature of my expertise. As senior compliance officer in the Financial Crimes Division, I spent my days identifying sophisticated attempts to conceal money movements, documenting chains of financial evidence, and building cases that could withstand both regulatory scrutiny and legal challenges. "Your husband thinks he married an accountant," Morgan observed as our planning continued. "He doesn't realize he married a financial detective." The description was apt. My daily work involved tracing money through increasingly complex channels, identifying shell companies established to obscure ownership, and documenting financial fraud patterns that perpetrators believed untraceable. I had testified in federal cases involving securities fraud and had received specialized training in forensic accounting techniques specifically designed to unravel deliberately obscured financial trails. These skills, the very expertise that had advanced my career at Meridian, now became my most powerful resource in countering Dexter's theft. "I need access to my professional network," I told Morgan and Kelsey as our strategy evolved. "Specifically, I need to contact Alexis Winters." Alexis had been my mentor at Meridian, the woman who had recruited me into financial crimes compliance after recognizing my aptitude for pattern recognition. Now serving as the department director, she had connections throughout the banking industry and relationships with financial crimes investigators at multiple regulatory agencies. "She can help us trace the money faster than conventional legal channels," I explained. "And she can place informal alerts within the banking network that might flag suspicious transfers before they're completed." Morgan made the call from my hospital room, putting it on speaker once Alexis answered. "Morgan Wilson? Ellie's sister?" Alexis's crisp, professional voice conveyed immediate concern. "Is everything all right? We heard Ellie was hospitalized." "That's why I'm calling," Morgan replied. "Ellie's here with me and needs to speak with you. It's urgent and confidential." I briefly explained the situation, my hospitalization, Dexter's systematic theft during my incapacitation, and our current counteroffensive. Alexis listened without interruption, her silence conveying the focused attention I remembered from our years working together. "Let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "Your husband has been liquidating your joint assets while you were incapacitated, appears to be transferring funds offshore, and is attempting to sell your home before you can legally intervene." "That's the situation," I confirmed. "We've secured an emergency injunction to freeze remaining domestic assets, but we need to trace what's already been moved." Alexis's response was immediate and resolute. "I'll activate our financial intelligence network. If he's moving substantial sums, especially internationally, it will leave markers in the system, no matter how careful he thinks he's being." What followed was a masterclass in financial investigation resources. Alexis outlined the tools available to us, both formal and informal, that could help document Dexter's actions and potentially recover diverted funds. Suspicious activity reports would have been automatically generated for large transfers, she explained. "Those aren't typically accessible to private parties, but I have contacts at FinCEN who might provide information given the circumstances." She continued methodically. "International transfers require correspondent banks, intermediaries that facilitate cross-border movements. Each leaves transaction records that can be subpoenaed with proper legal authority. Most valuably, Alexis offered access to Meridian's proprietary financial tracking software, tools designed specifically to identify and document sophisticated fraud schemes. I can assign one of our forensic specialists to run traces on accounts you identify. We'll need formal authorization once you're discharged, but I can begin preliminary work immediately given the time-sensitive nature. This professional support represented a resource Dexter couldn't possibly have anticipated. He might understand conventional banking well enough to establish offshore accounts, but he had no experience with the specialized systems designed specifically to catch people attempting exactly what he was doing. As Alexis outlined next steps, I felt the first genuine confidence that we might not only stop further theft, but potentially recover what had already been taken. "Send me everything you have so far," Alexis instructed. "Account numbers, transaction dates, any documentation of transfers or withdrawals. Our systems can establish patterns even with incomplete information." Morgan forwarded the evidence file we'd compiled, which now included bank statements Kelsey had photographed, property records Morgan had obtained from county offices, and records of recent account closures I had requested directly from our banks. "One more thing," Alexis added before ending the call. "I'm placing you on paid medical leave with full benefits secured. Dexter won't be able to access or modify your employment benefits without triggering multiple security flags. This protection of my employment benefits, particularly health insurance during ongoing recovery, removed another potential vulnerability Dexter might have exploited. The comprehensive safety net Alexis had activated within minutes of learning about my situation demonstrated the power of professional networks I had built over years of dedicated work. As we concluded the call, Alexis offered one final observation. "From what you've described, your husband has been following a fairly standard asset concealment playbook. The offshore accounts, accelerated property sale, and isolation tactics are textbook. And textbook methods have textbook vulnerabilities our systems are specifically designed to identify." After the call ended, our planning took on renewed energy and focus. With Alexis's resources complementing Vivian's legal strategy, we now had both the legal authority and the technical capability to trace and potentially recover diverted assets. "This changes everything," Morgan noted, updating our strategy board with the new resources now available. "Dexter's running a financial playbook against someone who literally wrote the rules for catching exactly these kinds of schemes. Beyond the practical advantages these professional connections provided, they offered something else I desperately needed: validation of my own expertise. After days of confronting how thoroughly Dexter had manipulated me personally, reconnecting with my professional identity restored a sense of competence and authority that his betrayal had temporarily undermined. I was not just a victim of financial exploitation. I was a financial crime specialist with the skills, training, and professional network to methodically dismantle the very scheme being used against me. "We should also consider Ruth's resources," I added, my mind cataloging all available assets. Not just the financial inheritance, but her connections. Ruth had been deeply involved in community organizations throughout her life, serving on the boards of several local foundations and maintaining connections with influential figures in Lakeside's business and civic circles. These relationships, built over decades of community engagement, represented another resource network Dexter had likely never considered. Her attorney, Harold Hargrove, has significant influence in the local legal community, I noted. And she was close friends with Judge Patricia Winters. Morgan's eyes widened slightly. "Judge Winters, who oversees the probate court division?" I nodded. "The same judge who will likely review aspects of both the inheritance transfer and, potentially, the emergency injunctions we filed. This wasn't about improper influence, but rather about ensuring our legal proceedings received appropriate priority and attention, given the time-sensitive nature of our situation." As our strategy session continued, the inventory of resources at our disposal grew increasingly impressive: professional expertise, legal connections, financial tracking systems, and community relationships that spanned decades. Dexter, operating alone or with only Emma's assistance, had significantly underestimated the counter-response his actions would trigger. He thought he was stealing from someone isolated and incapacitated, Kelsey observed. Instead, he's facing a coordinated team with specialized skills and significant resources. The realization strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about recovering stolen assets anymore. It was about demonstrating that expertise and professional networks could overcome even the most carefully planned betrayal. By the 10th day of my conscious recovery, our initial trio had evolved into a coordinated investigative team with specialized roles and capabilities. What had begun as an emergency response to Dexter's betrayal had transformed into a methodical investigation that leveraged professional expertise across multiple domains. Morgan served as our central coordinator, managing communications between team members while maintaining the pretense that I remained significantly impaired. Her background in clinical psychology provided valuable insights into Dexter's potential responses as our counteroffensive advanced. Kelsey continued gathering evidence from within the hospital system, documenting Dexter's representations about my condition and securing statements from other medical staff who had witnessed concerning behavior. Her brother Oliver, the network security specialist, had begun reviewing digital records for evidence of unauthorized access to my accounts. Alexis had assigned Raj Patel, Meridian Financial's senior forensic accountant, to trace the movement of our joint assets. With 20 years of experience unwinding complex financial fraud schemes, Raj brought technical capabilities that far exceeded what Dexter could have anticipated. "Your husband has been following a predictable pattern," Raj explained during a conference call. Large withdrawals broken into multiple smaller transfers to reduce flagging, funds moved through intermediary accounts before final destination, and documentation that creates plausible explanations for unusual activity. The technical term for this approach was structuring, deliberately arranging transactions to evade automatic monitoring systems. As a compliance officer, I had investigated dozens of structuring cases, each following similar patterns despite the perpetrators believing their approaches were uniquely undetectable. "He's made classic mistakes," Raj continued. "Consistent timing patterns in transfers, round number amounts, and predictable routing through specific intermediate accounts. These create signature patterns our systems are designed to identify." Within 48 hours of beginning his investigation, Raj had traced approximately $142,000 to a holding account in Grand Cayman, funds withdrawn from our joint investment portfolio and transferred through 3 domestic accounts before moving offshore. "He believes this money is now beyond reach," Raj explained. "But what he doesn't understand is that Cayman financial institutions maintain transaction records that can be accessed through proper legal channels. The era of true banking secrecy largely ended with international cooperation agreements following various financial crises. Vivian Taylor, our legal specialist, had successfully secured the emergency injunction freezing our remaining joint assets. More importantly, she had filed for expedited discovery, a legal process that would compel financial institutions to provide transaction records that would further document Dexter's activities. The judge was particularly concerned about the timing, Vivian reported. "The acceleration of financial activities during your hospitalization created a clear pattern that justified emergency intervention." Harold Hargrove, Ruth's attorney, had not only expedited the inheritance transfer, but had also connected us with retired Detective Adam Reeves, who specialized in financial exploitation cases. Though no longer actively serving, Adam maintained relationships throughout law enforcement and understood the intersection of civil and criminal approaches to financial crimes. "Document everything," was Adam's constant refrain during our strategy sessions. Criminal charges require establishing not just that money moved, but that it moved with fraudulent intent. Every representation Dexter made about your condition, every document he signed claiming authority he didn't have, every statement suggesting permanent impairment, these create the pattern of intent that prosecutors need. This growing team operated With remarkable coordination despite the compressed timeline and my continued hospitalization. Each morning began with a briefing on overnight developments. Each evening concluded with assigned tasks for the following day. Information flowed through secured channels established by Oliver, ensuring Dexter remained unaware of our increasingly sophisticated counteroffensive. As our investigation deepened, disturbing new discoveries emerged about both the timeline and scope of Dexter's planning. He opened the Cayman account 6 months ago, Raj reported during our third forensic briefing. Well before your illness, and there's evidence of a previously established account in Belize dating back approximately 18 months. This timeline confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My illness hadn't triggered Dexter's betrayal, but merely accelerated a plan already in motion. The methodical establishment of offshore accounts long before any medical emergency suggested. Premeditation that extended back potentially years. More troubling were Emma Sullivan's apparent connections to these arrangements. Raj's investigation revealed her name on the incorporation documents for a limited liability company that had received transfers from our joint investment account. Windward Consulting LLC, Raj explained, displaying the corporate registration, documents Oliver had obtained. Established 14 months ago with Emma Sullivan listed as managing member. The business address matches a mailbox service in Denver, but the formation agent is based in Belize. This discovery shifted our understanding of Emma's role from passive beneficiary to active participant. She wasn't merely the motivation for Dexter's exit. She was potentially a co-conspirator in the financial scheme itself. This strengthens potential criminal charges, Adam noted when presented with this evidence. Conspiracy requires proving shared intent and coordination. These corporate structures with both their names connected to diverted funds establish exact that. The most damning discovery came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emmett Lewis, reviewing my complete medical file as part of discharge planning, identified concerning patterns in my admission blood work. Your initial toxicology screening showed unusual levels of benzodiazepines, he informed me during a private consultation. At the time, it was assumed you might have taken sleep medication before your collapse, but the specific metabolite patterns are inconsistent with typical prescription medications. This clinical observation raised disturbing questions about whether my infection had been entirely natural or potentially facilitated by deliberate medication. Dr. Lewis stopped short of making accusations but recommended preserving blood samples for potential further testing. I'm not suggesting anything definitively, he clarified, but given the financial activities that occurred immediately following your admission, these anomalies warrant documentation. The possibility that Dexter might have contributed to my medical crisis added a chilling dimension to our investigation. While the evidence remained circumstantial, it suggested a level of calculation far beyond opportunistic financial exploitation. Morgan struggled visibly with this development. If he deliberately compromised your health to facilitate financial theft, she didn't need to complete the thought. Such actions would elevate the case from civil financial fraud to potential attempted homicide. Adam advised measured approach to this disturbing possibility. Document the medical anomalies but focus on the financial evidence, he counseled. Financial crimes are easier to prove conclusively than medical manipulation. We build the strongest case with the clearest evidence, then let additional findings support broader patterns. This strategic guidance reflected the reality of complex fraud cases. Prosecutors typically preferred charges with the highest probability of conviction rather than the most serious theoretical violations. As our investigation approached the 2-week mark, the comprehensive picture of Dexter's actions had become clearer, more documented, and significantly more disturbing than initially understood. What had begun as recovery of diverted assets had evolved into documentation of a potentially years-long conspiracy involving multiple participants and concerning medical questions. Through it all, I maintained the pretense of cognitive impairment. During Dexter's increasingly infrequent hospital visits, Each performance became more challenging as anger and betrayal crystallized into comprehensive understanding of his actions. But strategic necessity outweighed emotional catharsis. Maintaining the element of surprise remained essential to our recovery efforts. The compliance officer in me recognized that we were approaching the critical phase where investigation transforms into action. The evidence was substantial, the team assembled, and the legal groundwork established. What remained was determining the optimal moment to confront Dexter with the consequences of his betrayal. In complex financial investigations, timing is often the difference between recovery and permanent loss. Move too quickly, and evidence remains incomplete. Delay too long, and assets disappear beyond practical reach. The perfect intervention point balances maximum evidence development against minimum continued risk. By the 15th day of my conscious recovery, our team had identified an approaching window of opportunity that aligned multiple factors in our favor. The convergence of several critical events created what Adam called the ideal intervention timeline. First, the house closing scheduled for the following Tuesday represented Dexter's largest remaining liquidation target. With an expected sale price of $475,000, our home equity constituted the most significant joint asset he hadn't yet fully diverted. The emergency injunction had temporarily halted the sale, but Dexter was actively challenging that order through his attorney. Second, bank records obtained through expedited discovery revealed pending transfers from domestic accounts to the Cayman holding company, scheduled for execution on Wednesday. These transfers, totaling approximately $86,000, would move the last substantial domestic funds beyond immediate legal reach. Third, Dexter had booked one-way flights to Grand Cayman for himself and Emma, departing Friday evening, a discovery made by Oliver through access to airline reservation systems. This travel timing suggested he anticipated completing his financial extraction by then, with no intention of returning. Friday represents his exit point, Adam concluded during our strategy session. He believes the house closing will proceed Tuesday, the final transfers will clear Wednesday, and he'll have Thursday to resolve any remaining details before departure Friday. What Dexter didn't know was that our countermeasures were already disrupting this timeline. The emergency injunction had not only frozen remaining accounts, but had triggered fraud investigations at 2 banks. His attorney's challenge to the injunction had been scheduled for Thursday morning, deliberately placed on Judge Patricia Winter's docket through Harold Hargrove's procedural request for a specific judicial assignment. Thursday morning creates our perfect timing window, Vivian explained. He'll appear in court to challenge the injunction, unaware that we've developed comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud. When the judge upholds and potentially expands the asset freeze, he'll realize his plan has been compromised. This court appearance would create the ideal opportunity for formal service of additional legal documents. Divorce papers citing financial exploitation, criminal complaints filed with the district attorney's office, and civil recovery actions naming both Dexter and Emma as defendants. The psychological impact will be significant, Morgan noted. He believes he's challenging a routine temporary freeze based on medical confusion. Instead, he'll face comprehensive legal consequences with substantial evidence already secured. This timing strategy leveraged Dexter's own overconfidence. By allowing him to initiate the court challenge, we created an opportunity for maximum legal impact at precisely the moment he believed he was regaining control. He'll learn simultaneously that his wife is fully competent, his financial manipulations thoroughly documented, his co-conspirator equally implicated, and his escape plan compromised, Adam summarized. That convergence of realizations tends to trigger mistakes rather than calculated responses. The final element of our timing strategy involved my hospital discharge. Dr. Lewis had approved my release for Wednesday afternoon, allowing me to establish residence at Ruth's house, now legally transferred to my ownership, before Thursday's court hearing. Your physical presence in court, demonstrating clear cognitive function, becomes the final element he doesn't anticipate, Vivian advised. When combined with the documented evidence, it creates maximum impact. With our intervention timeline established, each team member focused on final preparations for Thursday's confrontation. Evidence was organized, legal filings prepared, security arrangements established at Ruth's house, and continual monitoring maintained on Dexter's activities. The perfect timing opportunity had emerged from the convergence of his own actions and our strategic response, creating a window where legal, financial, and personal elements aligned for maximum effectiveness. The execution of our counter-strategy began Wednesday morning, 36 hours before the scheduled court hearing. Each element had been carefully orchestrated to unfold in a sequence that would systematically dismantle Dexter's plan while maximizing asset recovery and legal consequences. The first phase activated at precisely 9 a.m. when Vivian filed our expanded legal complaint with the court. This comprehensive document detailed Dexter's systematic financial exploitation during my incapacitation, included affidavits from medical professionals confirming my cognitive competence, and presented forensic financial evidence tracing diverted assets. Most significantly, it named Emma Sullivan as co-defendant, documenting her role in establishing corporate structures used to conceal diverted funds. Simultaneously, Raj initiated financial security protocols through Meridian's networks. These protocols flagged all accounts connected to Dexter Wilson and Emma Sullivan for enhanced monitoring, placed temporary administrative holds on selected international transfers pending verification, and activated cross-institutional alerts, designed to identify new account applications. Financial institutions maintain shared security networks precisely for fraud scenarios, Raj had explained during our planning session. Once high-risk indicators are flagged in the system, any new financial activity will trigger immediate review. At 11:30 a.m., Adam delivered our evidence package to Detective Sarah Martinez in the Financial Crimes Division of the Lakeside Police Department. This carefully organized documentation established the legal elements required for criminal charges: unauthorized access to financial accounts, deliberate misrepresentation of medical condition to facilitate theft, and interstate movement of fraudulently obtained funds. Martinez will review, but not act immediately, Adam had advised. The goal is having charges prepared but not filed until after Thursday's hearing. This prevents Dexter from being warned through the criminal process before the civil confrontation, the SAR. Most personally significant phase of our plan began at 2 p.m. when Dr. Lewis signed my hospital discharge papers. After 17 days of hospitalization, including 15 days of conscious recovery and strategic planning, I was officially returning to independent living. Morgan accompanied me from the hospital, not to the home Dexter was attempting to sell, but to Ruth's Victorian house that now belonged to me. Walking through the front door of my grandmother's home, now my home, produced a complex wave of emotions. Grief for Ruth's absence mingled with gratitude for her foresight in protecting her assets from Dexter's reach. The familiar surroundings, the antique grandfather clock in the entryway, the built-in bookshelves filled with classics Ruth had collected over decades, the stained glass window that cast colorful patterns across the hardwood floors, provided both comfort and strategic advantage. "He doesn't know you're here," Morgan reminded me as we settled into the living room. "He believes you're being transferred to Lakeside Rehabilitation Facility tomorrow morning." This misperception was deliberate, maintained through Kelsey's careful management of information within the hospital system. Official records indicated a scheduled Thursday morning transfer that would never occur, creating a window where Dexter would be uncertain of my exact location. The final preparatory phase unfolded Wednesday evening when Oliver confirmed that Dexter had checked in for his Thursday morning court appearance through his attorney's online portal. This digital confirmation indicated he intended to personally attend the hearing challenging the emergency injunction, exactly as we had anticipated. "He's committed to the timeline," Oliver reported during our final strategy call. "Airline reservations remain unchanged for Friday evening. He clearly expects to resolve the injunction issue tomorrow, and complete financial movements before departure. As evening settled over Ruth's Victorian home, our team conducted final reviews of each component. Legal documents were verified, evidence, packages confirmed, and security protocols tested. Morgan would accompany me to court, while Adam and Vivian would manage the legal proceedings. Raj would monitor financial systems in real time, prepared to trace any last-minute attempts to move assets. The months of deception Dexter had orchestrated were about to meet the systematic response of a team with specialized expertise in precisely the areas his plan had violated. His careful extraction of our joint assets, conducted while he believed me incapacitated and isolated, would face the coordinated counteroffensive he never anticipated. Before retiring to Ruth's guest bedroom, now temporarily mine, I paused. At the window overlooking the garden she had tended so meticulously. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, legal consequences, and the formal dismantling of my marriage. Yet beneath the trepidation, I felt something unexpected, a quiet confidence in my own capabilities and the team we had assembled. Dexter had fundamentally misjudged not just my recovery timeline, but the professional resources and personal resilience his betrayal would activate. That misjudgment would become evident in less than 12 hours. Courtroom 307 of the Lakeside County Courthouse maintained the formal austerity typical of judicial proceedings. Dark wood paneling, the state seal, mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, and the subtle but pervasive tension of consequential decisions. I sat beside Morgan in the second row, positioned to observe Dexter without being immediately visible from the entrance. He arrived at 9:42 a.m., precisely 18 minutes before the scheduled hearing. As always, his appearance was meticulously managed: charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, crisp white shirt, burgundy tie secured in a perfect Windsor knot. The confidence in his posture suggested a man who anticipated a minor procedural matter rather than a life-altering confrontation. Beside him walked a man I recognized as James Thornton, a local attorney known for handling business transactions rather than complex litigation. This choice of legal representation confirmed our assessment. Dexter expected to easily dismiss the emergency injunction as a misunderstanding resulting from my supposed cognitive impairment. They settled at the respondent's table, Dexter leaning forward to whisper something that prompted a small smile from his attorney. Neither glanced toward the gallery where I sat, my presence still unnoticed amid the routine activity of the court. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order as Judge Patricia Winters entered, a woman in her early 60s whose reputation for meticulous attention to financial matters had made her Ruth's friend and professional ally for decades. "We're hearing emergency motions in Wilson versus Wilson," Judge Winters announced, reviewing the documents before her. "I understand there are expanded filings this morning?" Vivian rose from the petitioner's table. "Yes, Your Honor. We've submitted comprehensive documentation regarding the systematic financial exploitation outlined in our original emergency petition. Additionally, we've named Emma Sullivan as co-respondent based on evidence of her participation in diverting marital assets." Dexter's posture shifted subtly, the first indication that proceedings weren't following his anticipated script. His attorney appeared momentarily confused, flipping through papers as if searching for references to these expanded allegations. "Furthermore," Vivian continued, "the petitioner is present in court today and prepared to testify regarding her medical condition and financial circumstances." This statement triggered the moment I had anticipated for 15 days. Dexter's head snapped up, eyes scanning the courtroom until they locked with mine. The progression of emotions across his face occurred in microseconds but revealed volumes: initial confusion, dawning recognition, momentary disbelief, and finally, unmistakable alarm. I held his gaze steadily, allowing no hint of the emotional turmoil beneath my composed exterior. The compliance officer who had investigated dozens of financial fraud cases was now witnessing the moment a perpetrator realizes their scheme has been discovered. That unique blend of panic, calculation, and desperate recalibration. Judge Winters noticed the exchange. I take it the petitioner is present? Would she please identify herself for the record? I stood, smoothing the tailored navy suit I had specifically selected for this appearance. Eleanor Montgomery Wilson, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Mrs. Wilson, I understand from these filings that you were recently hospitalized but have been discharged? Yes, Your Honor. I was discharged yesterday afternoon following successful treatment for a severe infection and have recovered full cognitive function, as documented in the medical assessments included in our filings. Dexter leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently. The lawyer appeared increasingly concerned, reviewing documents with growing agitation before addressing the court. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were informed that Mrs. Wilson was suffering significant cognitive impairment and would be transferred to a rehabilitation facility this morning. These expanded allegations and her unexpected appearance require time for proper response. Judge Winters studied the attorney with measured skepticism. Mr. Thornton, the court has received extensive medical documentation confirming Mrs. Wilson's cognitive competence, including assessments from 3 independent specialists. Are you suggesting these medical professionals have misrepresented her condition? No, Your Honor, but my client has been operating under different medical information Information provided by whom? The judge interrupted. The question hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Dexter's attorney hesitated, suddenly aware of the precarious position. We request a continuance to properly address these expanded allegations, he finally stated, avoiding the direct question. Judge Winters reviewed the documents before her, then looked directly at Dexter. Mr. Wilson, these filings contain extremely serious allegations regarding your management of marital assets during your wife's hospitalization. They include documented evidence of substantial transfers to offshore accounts, attempts to sell jointly owned property without proper authorization, and coordination with Ms. Sullivan in establishing corporate structures that received diverted funds, she continued, her tone measured but firm. Given the comprehensive evidence presented and the risk of irreparable harm through further asset dissipation, I am not only upholding the emergency injunction, but expanding it to include all financial accounts and assets connected to both you and Ms. Sullivan, including those established internationally. The impact of this ruling registered visibly on Dexter's face, the controlled facade crumbling as he realized the comprehensive nature of our counteroffensive. This wasn't merely a temporary delay to his plans, it was their complete dismantling, through legal mechanisms he hadn't anticipated. The moment of impact, that pivotal point where betrayal meets consequence, had arrived with devastating precision. The formal consequences of Dexter's actions cascaded with a momentum he clearly hadn't anticipated. Following Judge Winters' expansion of the emergency injunction, the procedural gears of legal accountability began turning with inexorable precision. As we exited the courtroom, Adam nodded to Detective Martinez, who approached with 2 uniformed officers. The detective's timing had been coordinated to coincide with the conclusion of the civil hearing, ensuring maximum impact while maintaining procedural propriety. Mr. Wilson, Detective Martinez stated formally, I need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation into financial exploitation and fraud. Please come with me. Dexter's attempt at composure faltered visibly. This is ridiculous. Whatever my wife has told you. This isn't simply based on statements, sir, Martinez interrupted. We have documented evidence of unauthorized financial transactions, misrepresentations to financial institutions, and interstate wire transfers executed under fraudulent pretenses. While not a formal arrest, the police interview would initiate the criminal process that our evidence package had set in motion. As Dexter was escorted away by the officers, his attorney trailing behind in evident confusion, I experienced a complex emotional response, not satisfaction or vindication, but a somber recognition of necessary consequences. Outside the courthouse, reporters from 2 local news outlets approached, Alerted by the public nature of the court filings, financial exploitation cases rarely attracted media attention, but the substantial amounts involved and Dexter's standing in the investment community had apparently triggered journalistic interest. "Mrs. Wilson," one reporter called, "can you comment on the allegations against your husband?" Morgan stepped forward protectively, but I placed a hand gently on her arm. The very isolation that had facilitated Dexter's theft now needed to be countered through appropriate transparency. "This is an ongoing legal matter involving the diversion of substantial assets during my recent medical incapacitation," I stated, carefully. "I'm working with authorities to ensure accountability and recovery of misappropriated funds. Financial exploitation affects many vulnerable individuals, and addressing it requires both personal courage and systemic responses." This measured statement accomplished multiple strategic objectives, establishing the basic facts without emotional embellishment, placing my experience within the broader context of financial exploitation, and signaling to other potential victims that legal remedies existed. The wider recognition of Dexter's actions spread quickly beyond the courthouse and brief media coverage. By that afternoon, his office at Wilson Financial Services had been secured by regulatory authorities from the Securities Exchange Commission, responding to formal notifications from Alexis regarding potential client fund irregularities. The regulatory review is standard protocol following financial fraud allegations against investment advisors, Alexis explained during our update call. "Every client account will be audited for potential mismanagement or unauthorized transactions." This regulatory intervention extended the consequences beyond our personal financial relationship to Dexter's professional practice and reputation. The carefully constructed image he had built within the financial community, the trusted advisor, the meticulous manager of wealth, was unraveling under official scrutiny. Even more consequential was the notification system activated through banking networks. Financial institutions maintained collaborative alert systems for potential fraud patterns, and Raj's formal flagging of Dexter's activities had cascaded through these networks, creating heightened scrutiny of any accounts connected to him or Emma. "The Cayman institutions have implemented administrative freezes pending investigation," Raj reported. "Standard international banking agreements include fraud exception provisions that override normal privacy protections when presented with sufficient evidence of financial crimes." By Thursday evening, the formal consequences had expanded to include Emma Sullivan, who was interviewed by financial crimes investigators regarding her role in establishing corporate entities that received diverted funds. Her apparent attempt to access airline reservation systems to modify their Friday departures had been flagged and prevented through Oliver's monitoring protocols. The wider community recognition of what had occurred spread through personal networks as well. Former clients called to express shock and concern. Neighbors who had observed the "for sale" sign suddenly appearing at our home connected it to my hospitalization with new understanding. Even my in-laws, previously kept uninformed about my condition through Dexter's careful information management, reached out after learning about the situation through media coverage. "We had no idea, Ellie," Dexter's mother said when she called. That evening, her voice strained with evident distress. "He told us you were recovering but needed complete privacy. We never imagined." This expanding awareness created an unexpected form of accountability. The social and professional consequences that accompanied the formal legal process. The man who had believed he could silently extract our financial life and disappear was, instead, facing comprehensive scrutiny across multiple systems. As Thursday transitioned to Friday, the date Dexter had planned for his departure to Grand Cayman, he instead remained in Lakeside. His passport surrendered as a condition of release following police questioning, his accounts frozen, and his professional reputation disintegrating, under regulatory investigation. The formal consequences had only begun to unfold, but their trajectory was now irreversibly established through legal, regulatory, and social mechanisms that would ensure accountability for his betrayal. 3 months after the courthouse confrontation, I sat in Ruth's, now my sunroom, surrounded by documentation from what we had come to call the Recovery Project. Spreadsheets tracking asset reclamation, legal proceedings status reports, and financial restructuring plans covered the antique oak table that had hosted Ruth's bridge games for decades. The practical outcomes of our counteroffensive had exceeded even our team's optimistic projections. Through coordinated legal and financial interventions, we had recovered approximately 82% of the diverted assets. The remaining funds, primarily those Dexter had already spent on luxury purchases and travel with Emma, would eventually be addressed through the civil judgment now formally entered against both of them. Dexter had ultimately accepted a plea agreement on reduced charges of financial exploitation and wire fraud, resulting in a 30-month federal prison sentence and restitution obligations that would extend well beyond his incarceration. Emma had negotiated a more limited plea focusing on her role in establishing corporate structures, resulting in probation and shared restitution requirements. These practical consequences represented necessary justice, but they formed only part of my ongoing recovery journey. The more profound transformation occurred internally, reshaping my understanding of trust, security, and personal agency in ways that extended far beyond financial restoration. "You've created something important here," Morgan observed, joining me in the sunroom with 2 cups of tea. "Something that matters beyond your personal situation." She was referring to the Financial Vulnerability Protection Initiative I had established using a portion of Ruth's inheritance. Working with Alexis, Harold, and other professionals who had supported my recovery, we had created educational and intervention resources specifically designed for individuals facing potential financial exploitation during health crises. The initiative had begun modestly: a website offering warning signs and protection strategies, a referral network connecting vulnerable individuals with specialized legal and financial services, and training materials for healthcare providers to identify potential exploitation. Within weeks, it had expanded to include direct intervention, services for active cases similar to mine. 3 new cases this week alone, I noted, reviewing the intake reports, all following similar patterns: health crises creating vulnerability, trusted individuals exploiting access to financial resources, isolation preventing early intervention. This transformation of personal trauma into community resource reflected Ruth's influence, her lifelong belief that difficulties gained meaning when channeled into service. The Victorian house that her protective foresight had placed beyond Dexter's reach now hosted weekly support groups for financial exploitation. Survivors, creating community from shared experience. My professional transformation paralleled these community efforts. After taking extended leave from Meridian Financial to manage my recovery, I had accepted a specialized position within Alexis's department, focusing exclusively on exploitation cases involving medically vulnerable individuals. This role leveraged both my technical expertise in financial investigation and my personal understanding of exploitation dynamics. "You've found a way to integrate the experience rather than just survive it," Dr. Abigail Chen, the therapist who had supported my emotional recovery, observed during our bi-weekly session. "That's the difference between recovery and transformation." This integration manifested in practical security measures as well as emotional processing. I had restructured my financial life with layered protections, multiple accounts with different institutions, authentication systems requiring biometric verification, and regular review protocols with trusted advisors. These mechanisms acknowledged the reality of vulnerability without surrendering to fear. Perhaps most significantly, my understanding of relationships had undergone fundamental recalibration. The betrayal that might have fostered permanent distrust instead catalyzed more nuanced discernment. I had not withdrawn from connection, but had developed more sophisticated assessment of relationship patterns, distinguishing between authentic support and performance of care. Morgan had relocated to Lakeside, accepting a teaching position at NUN, the local university that allowed her to remain close while maintaining professional growth. Kelsey had become both friend and collaborator in the Financial Vulnerability Initiative, contributing healthcare perspectives to our intervention models. Alexis, Raj, Adam, and others who had formed our response team remained connected as both professional resources and personal supports. Through these evolving relationships, I recognized that Dexter's betrayal revealed more about his character than about the fundamental possibility of trust. Some connections, like those with Morgan, Ruth, and the team who rallied around my recovery, demonstrated that authentic support existed alongside the reality of exploitation risk. "You've built something stronger than what was taken," Morgan noted, gesturing toward the initiative materials spread across the table. That's the part Dexter never anticipated. Indeed, the man who had systematically dismantled our shared financial life could never have foreseen that his betrayal would ultimately catalyze not just recovery, but transformation, creating resources, awareness, and intervention systems that would prevent countless others from experiencing similar exploitation. As spring sunshine filtered through Ruth's carefully preserved stained glass windows, illuminating both recovery documentation and initiative planning materials, I recognized that my grandmother's protective legacy extended beyond the financial inheritance that had secured my immediate stability. Her true gift had been modeling the transformation of adversity into purpose, a template I was now following in my own distinct way. The vulnerability Dexter had exploited had become the foundation for both personal resilience and community resource. Transformation that redefined victory far beyond the courtroom confrontation or asset recovery statistics. 1 year after my hospitalization, I stood before an audience of healthcare providers, financial professionals, attorneys, and survivors at the first annual conference of the Financial Vulnerability Protection Initiative. The gathering represented the formal expansion of what had begun as my personal recovery strategy into a structured organization addressing systemic vulnerabilities. "Financial exploitation during health crises thrives in isolation," I explained, concluding my keynote address. "The perpetrators count on shame-silencing victims, on systems operating in silos rather than coordination, on the gap between medical recovery and financial protection. Our work bridges these gaps, creating connection where isolation once enabled exploitation." As I surveyed the room, filled with professionals who had committed to implementing protection protocols and survivors whose experiences informed our approach, I reflected on the philosophical journey that had transformed a personal betrayal into a community resource. The fundamental question underlying this transformation wasn't simply how to recover what was taken, but how to create meaning from an experience designed to diminish rather than enhance life. Dexter's actions had been intended to reduce me, financially, emotionally, and physically. Yet the ultimate outcome had generated expansion instead, wider professional impact, deeper personal resilience, and broader community connection. This paradoxical result reflected what philosophers call post-traumatic growth, the capacity for significant positive change emerging from life crises. The betrayal that might have fostered permanent victimhood had instead catalyzed a more purposeful trajectory, not despite the trauma, but through its integration and transformation. The Victorian house that Ruth had protected from Dexter's reach now served as both home and headquarters for the initiative, its architecture reflecting our philosophical approach. The structure maintained its historical integrity while incorporating modern security systems, honoring tradition while acknowledging contemporary vulnerabilities. The garden Ruth had tended continued flourishing, now partly maintained by survivors who found healing in nurturing growth from soil that remained fertile despite seasonal challenges. My personal recovery continued alongside the initiative's development. The divorce had finalized, legal proceedings had established appropriate consequences, and financial recovery had secured practical stability. These necessary resolutions created foundation for forward movement rather than endpoint for the journey. Perhaps, most significantly, my understanding of strength had fundamentally transformed. I no longer equated strength with invulnerability or independence with isolation. True resilience, I had discovered, emerged from appropriate interdependence, the capacity to build systems of mutual support that acknowledged vulnerability without surrendering to exploitation. Dexter had fundamentally miscalculated in believing my vulnerability represented weakness to be exploited rather than humanity to be honored. That miscalculation had ultimately cost him everything: freedom, reputation, professional standing, and financial security, while creating unexpected growth possibilities for me and protection resources for countless others. As the conference transitioned to workshop sessions, healthcare providers learning exploitation warning signs, financial professionals implementing protection protocols, survivors sharing intervention strategies, I recognized that Ruth's legacy continued expanding. Through this work, her protective foresight hadn't just secured my individual recovery, it had seeded resources that would prevent countless others from experiencing similar exploitation. The grandmother who had cautioned me to maintain independent security had ultimately provided both the practical resources and philosophical template for transforming betrayal into purpose, a legacy that continued generating protection far beyond what Dexter had attempted to destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.